We are mere days away from what is supposedly going to be one of PlayStation's biggest showcases in a good long while. And for many of us, I think there's a part of us that hopes the Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic remake will be shown and will appear at the event in some capacity, although I have my doubts. And we are now closing in on June 2023, 1 month away from the 20th anniversary of the original game. Which is also, funnily enough, 1 month away from what was the original release window within Aspyr for the KOTOR Remake. And yet, here we are, 2 years later almost after the game was announced, and we've heard pretty much nothing official. However, I was very fortunate to have some friends within Aspyr Media at the time of the game's development, and I was privy to some of the things that were going on, and I am constantly asked about the game now, and I'm constantly asked about its progress, I'm asked for updates and whatnot, so I thought I'd make this video, which is one big video that encapsulates every single thing that happened in regards to the KOTOR remake at Aspyr, as well as the specific things that I know about the game itself, so you guys have kind of got the full picture that I do, regardless of whether or not we get something official in the next couple of days. We also have the Embracer Q4 earnings report tomorrow as well, which is another potential place that we might get some information about the game. It's possible, but unlikely again. However, I did send in some questions regarding the game, so maybe they'll get answered at the report. As always, I have to preface videos like this by saying this is my perspective of events based on the things that I was told by my sources and friends within the company, and you are totally within your right to question me or be skeptical of the things I'm saying. As always, take these things with a grain of salt. It's what I do with videos like this that aren't mine. So, the tale of the KOTOR remake supposedly started around 2018. A number of companies were vying for the potential to work on a KOTOR project, and they were pitching their visions to Lucasfilm. I heard one rumor that Obsidian was one of these potential companies to pitch a KOTOR game, but I can't confirm that. There was also an official pitch for a remaster of both games called the KOTOR Reforged Collection by a company called Beamdog, and of course a little studio called Aspyr Media also chimed in with a potential remake. Aspyr at this point already had a great relationship with Lucasfilm. They had ported the original Knights of the Old Republic to a variety of different platforms, as well as many other Star Wars projects in that regard, and so they pitched a Knights of the Old Republic remake to Lucasfilm, and they absolutely loved it. And so out of all of the companies, Aspyr won the right to use the IP, and they began planning the studio's future. But it was also at this time that a fan mod was being created called KOTOR Aperion, which was going around on social media and was becoming quite popular. This was essentially a ground-up recreation of Knights of the Old Republic that went under the guise of a mod of the original game. And the legality of this situation was very difficult. Because that Aspyr now had the rights to the Knights of the Old Republic IP, and especially a remake was in development, this fan mod was kind of a threat to their project. So, around the back end of 2018 and before the KOTOR remake and Aspyr went into official pre-production on the game, Aperion was given a cease and desist by Lucasfilm to destroy the mod and anything related to Star Wars that they had created. Now, I can't confirm this as an unequivocal fact, but it's logical to assume just based on the timing that it's because the company didn't want the confusion between the two remakes existing. There are many Star Wars fan mods out there, there are many Star Wars fan films out there, and Lucasfilm tend to let most of them get away with it. But this specific mod, for no real reason, was hit with a cease and desist, and all you have to kind of do is put 2 and 2 together here as to why. Once this was dealt with, around 2019 or so, the game began pre-production at Aspyr Media. This is the pre-planning stage for everything, the initial writing, the business development, the hiring, the building the framework, the concepting, the art, prototyping, managing the teams, the day-to-day plans, all of the progression that they're going to have to go through, and much more. It is essentially laying down the total foundations for full production of the game to go ahead without any real delay. But then, of course, unfortunately in 2020, COVID happened. and the whole games industry was kind of adjusting to going remote, and it was taking a lot more time for things to get done, and so the pre-production stage on the KOTOR remake went on a little bit longer than perhaps they were anticipating, but during this time they began to build a team of exceptional talent, with some of the most prestigious creators in the gaming industry joining the studio, and that included people who worked on the original Knights of the Old Republic, true veterans of the franchise. They were designing Aspyr from the ground up to be a studio that was essentially the Old Republic studio, because they had big plans. Now, pre-production went on for about a year or so, and Aspyr themselves were acquired by the Embracer Group, a rather large video game media holding company in early 2021, and Aspyr themselves were placed directly under Saber Interactive within Embracer, so essentially Aspyr are a subsidiary of another subsidiary that had its own kind of autonomy within Embracer. It's all very kind of confusing. It was also at this point that a ridiculously large sum of money was invested into Aspyr to help with the KOTOR remake, a budget that came to over $70 million, notwithstanding the money that was already put into the game by Aspyr themselves. It's very possible that we are talking about a KOTOR remake that has a budget of over $100 million, which is very, very significant. And by this point in 2021, the company was now in a very stable position. And as they were on the precipice of moving the KOTOR remake into full production, they already had a small team that started the planning phase for the pre-production of a Knights of the Old Republic 2 remake. As I mentioned, Aspyr as a studio had high hopes for the Knights of the Old Republic franchise, and they basically wanted to be the new BioWare. And so with the KOTOR remake in production and the potential plans for a KOTOR 2 remake going into pre-production, you can only guess where this led to for Aspyr: a KOTOR 3. Additionally, it was around this time that Sony were brought on board as a partner of the project, and supposedly Microsoft were also approached in regards to having the exclusivity on the title, much like the original game in 2003. But unfortunately, Microsoft and Xbox rejected it because they didn't want to support a studio that they didn't own that was working on an outside IP. So this is why the Indiana Jones game went to Bethesda, because they were quite happy to license something from Lucasfilm, but they wanted their own people to work on it, and Aspyr were not that. And that kind of made sense. However, the Sony deal was a little bit confusing, and it's something that I'm not entirely sure on, because even my sources within Aspyr didn't really understand Sony's position and why they held so much power over Aspyr. You have to remember that Aspyr were the ones that owned the IP. Aspyr, Saber, and Embracer had the Knights of the Old Republic remake license from Lucasfilm because they had won it many years before. And as far as we know, the Knights of the Old Republic remake was only a timed exclusive for the PS5. It wasn't owned by Sony in that regard, and while the game was being specifically built for the PS5's hardware and PC, I don't know whether Sony was actually funding the game in some way, or whether they had just paid Embracer or Saber a lump sum to have it exclusive for a period. I don't really know. But they were marketing it as one of the PS5's killer apps that was built for the system, which again is a little odd considering it wasn't a complete exclusive to the platform. But because of that expectation, Sony were expecting the game to be something very specific. And then, with the Sony deal done, they officially announced the Knights of the Old Republic remake at a PlayStation Showcase in September 2021, but the Sony deal is where things began to go very wrong. By December 2021, the Knights of the Old Republic remake moved into full production so that when everybody returned from the Christmas break, it was all hands on deck. Now at this point, Aspyr had a specific release window for where they wanted to release the game, and that was the 20th anniversary of Knights of the Old Republic, July 2023, which was conveniently placed just after EA's 10-year exclusivity deal expired, and although this wasn't definitive it was the window they intended to target. However, I was specifically told by employees that they thought this date was very generous given the scale and the complexity of the game they were building, and they personally didn't expect it to release much later into, say, mid-2024, maybe even 2025 anyway. There was also a little bit of controversy regarding the hiring of the writer Sam Maggs, who was quite a controversial figure in the gaming industry. And regardless of whether or not you like her or dislike her, there is a lot of misinformation going around that claims she was the lead writer or she was heading the story of the game, which is totally untrue. She was just a writer on the team and eventually left. And from the beginning of 2022, full development on the KOTOR remake went on without a hitch for a good 5 or 6 months under the codename Project Romeo up until June 2022, where it was time for Aspyr to show their partners their vertical slice for the game. This is essentially a small portion of the game that is completely finished, that is working in almost totality, and they showed it to Lucasfilm and Sony, their partners. Now, I was told that Lucasfilm absolutely loved what Aspyr had made, bearing in mind that Lucasfilm had been working with Aspyr for many years at this point regarding the game, and they knew what they were making. However, Sony, on the other hand, who were technically a newer partner, were very, very angry. Sony have a reputation for having the leading standards in cinematic storytelling. Their action-adventure games like God of War, Uncharted, and The Last of Us set the bar in that regard. And while Aspyr had developed a third-person action game, the gameplay of Knights of the Old Republic remake was very similar to the Final Fantasy VII remake in that it had turn-based elements. However, the cinematic presentation was not this big, seamless, movie-like cinematic experience in the same vein of a God of War or The Last of Us. And so, Sony's reaction basically caused the leadership of Aspyr to essentially panic. Sony was considered to be one of their valued partners. They didn't want to upset Sony. And so, in the heat of the moment, they made a terrible decision to fire the design director of the game and the art director, two people responsible for how the game looks and feels, as a kind of show of good faith to Sony that they were willing to shift development of the game towards what Sony wanted instead. And these two firings came out of nowhere, and it actually came as a massive shock to the people within Aspyr, to the employees, because up until this point the morale for the remake was at an all-time high, the atmosphere within the studio was like a family unit, with some people even calling it the best team they had ever worked on, bearing in mind that some of these people were leading veterans of the gaming industry, and so this sudden development was utterly devastating. And the thing is, even the employees were told at the time by the leadership of Aspyr that the firing of these two directors was actually a big mistake and they regretted doing it. After this had happened though, for June and July pretty much, the leadership of Aspyr went completely silent on its own employees. They were frantically trying to work with Sony, Embracer and Saber, presumably on how they could fix the problem and steer the game into a certain direction. And so they even began searching for a new creative director for the game, and I was told they wanted someone with the top end of experience in the industry to help smoothen the transition and get the game back on track. However, things went from bad to terrible for Aspyr, because somebody within the studio had decided to go to Jason Schreier and Bloomberg regarding the whole situation. Now, of course, the quality of journalism in the gaming industry is rather low nowadays, as many of us know, and the only real way for Bloomberg to generate the clicks they wanted to their paid article, what a surprise, was essentially to make out that the KOTOR remake was screwed. And so they drummed up this controversy which picked up steam exactly the way Bloomberg wanted. The entire internet were exclaiming that the KOTOR remake was cancelled, that it wouldn't be released until 26 or perhaps even 27, being delayed by 4 or 5 years, that it was being rebuilt from the ground up, Lucas and Sony despised it, blah blah blah, all of this nonsensical stuff that wasn't true. Although there were like little nuggets of information in the article that were true because I was told the exact same things, I immediately knew that Jason was making a lot of this stuff up to drive up the controversy and generate those clicks, because he had claimed that the game was supposedly planning to release at the end of 2022, which was legitimately impossible considering that EA had an exclusivity agreement with Lucasfilm in that regard, so they couldn't have released it then even if they wanted to, and it wouldn't have made sense to release it at the end of 2022 when the 20th anniversary was literally 6 months ahead of that. And unfortunately, it was because of this article that Aspyr as a studio were basically devastated. Because while they were trying to rectify their relationship with Sony and deal with things internally at the top and with their partners on how they were going to move forward, things were becoming even more difficult because Bloomberg was putting an extreme amount of pressure on both Aspyr, Saber, and Embracer. Now, as this was all happening for about a month moving into late July, employees at Aspyr were still working on the KOTOR Remake despite Jason's claims that development had been paused as of June, and this is something I can personally testify to being false because I was told exactly what the employees were working on a very specific date. And while they were still working on the game for a good 2 months and a half, it was only around mid-August when things did actually get paused, and this is because of the fallout of Jason Schreier's article and the complete capitulation of the leadership of Aspyr, who just didn't know what to do at this point. And this basically forced Embracer's hands. There was a press release by Embracer that essentially stated that one of their big projects had moved to another developer within Embracer to ensure the quality was up to par, and this move wouldn't cause any material delays. And still, at this point, Aspyr were not communicating with their employees, who were totally in the dark and very frustrated by this point. Development on the game had been paused, but many had hoped that things would resume with the attempted hiring of a new creative director, and while they were helping other studios within Embracer in the meantime so they weren't sitting around doing nothing, they eventually had an all-hands meeting at the end of August with the higher-ups of the studio, where the employees grilled the Aspyr leadership in regards to the press release that was made by Embracer, and they didn't deny it to their own employees. And so after about 2 months of being in the dark, this refusal from their leadership to deny this report pretty much, although not directly, confirmed to the employees internally that they were not continuing and that the remake was being moved to another studio. And so from September onwards, Aspyr were basically in limbo. Many of the employees were still hopeful at this point that maybe they would continue making the game by helping Saber Interactive, with Aspyr perhaps taking more of a supporting role in development rather than a leadership role in regarding the game, but sadly this didn't happen. I was specifically told that only the writing team at Aspyr that worked on the KOTOR remake were absorbed into Saber, and they continued to work on it, and that Saber themselves took everything that Aspyr had made directly, presumably building upon what was already there, going against many of the claims that they had scrapped everything and they were rebuilding the remake from the ground up, which just isn't true. Then in around late September, early October 2022, you can see on LinkedIn alone, this is all public, that employees at Aspyr began to leave in droves when the KOTOR remake was basically confirmed internally to be lost, with pretty much all of the major positions going to new studios, and as a matter of fact, over a quarter of the entire studio's employee base left, going from nearly 200 employees to around 130 by December 2022, which is honestly staggering. As we moved into the late months of 2022, I was then told around late October that Aspyr were looking into potential remakes for other but smaller Star Wars classics instead, going as far to even prototype a few within the studio, because at this point they were totally resigned to not helping or continuing with the KOTOR remake. But then, to put the nail in the coffin, around December 2022, there was an interview at a Comic-Con in Portugal with the CEO of Saber Porto, which is one of the home-based studios of Saber Interactive. Saber themselves are a parent company of many studios, and while some of them were acquired, many of them were local studios like Saber Sweden, Saber Russia, Saber Spain and whatnot, and it was confirmed here that Saber Porto and the more localized studios were indeed now working on the KOTOR remake. Now at the time, the employees within Aspyr didn't know specifically what studio within Saber had taken over the KOTOR remake. All they knew was that Saber Interactive had taken over, which as I said was the parent company of all of these smaller studios, including Aspyr. And when I showed my sources the interview with the CEO of Saber Porto, they were legitimately gobsmacked. Like, they could not believe that this was the studio that was replacing them. Aspyr was legitimately built from the ground up to have some of the most experienced game developers in the entire industry, and they had been replaced by a studio that had barely anything in regards to experience, and they were genuinely shocked that Saber and Embracer believed that they were more fit to complete the game than them. Now for the part that many of you are looking forward to. In terms of the game itself, I was told a variety of things regarding it. For example, the gameplay was very similar to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, as I mentioned, and not an action-adventure game / God of War clone that many people were claiming it to be. I was told that pretty much all of the voice actors from the original game were coming back, bar a few that sadly passed away, and I was also told that the voice actor for Darth Malak, Rafael Ferrer, was being replaced with another voice actor called Jason Spisak, who is really, really good. I was told the protagonist of the game was fully voiced, both male and female. It had the same amount of variety and choice there, and I was also told that they weren't adding anything significant. I specifically asked my sources whether they were considering doing things like making Ythora a companion, whether they were perhaps looking at new companions in general, or perhaps new planets. While I was told this was something they really wanted to do, because of its scale just as a remake alone, adding things to it was something they just couldn't do. But because they weren't adding anything new, they were significantly expanding upon what was already there. So for example, many of the companion storylines were majorly expanded upon, a lot of the romances were delved into a lot more deeply, a lot of the quest lines had a lot more variety and had a lot more choice, and the overall narrative itself, while still following the exact same progression, was also going to be expanded upon too. Now, all of the minigames were coming back, swoop racing, Pazark and whatnot, and I was also told there was a few other additions, such as Saul Karath and Calo Nord being gender flipped, and that there was some NPCs and whatnot that had no real relevance on the story, that had their genders and their races changed, so that the game was a little bit more diverse. And as we head into Sony's big PlayStation Showcase and Embracer's Q4 earnings call, as of May 2023, this is everything I know about the Knights of the Old Republic remake, and this is essentially from beginning to end the kind of tragic downfall of the KOTOR remake at Aspyr. And while I know for a fact that the game is in development at Saber, despite a lot of people claiming that it's never going to come out, such as Jeff Grubb, all we can do is keep waiting patiently for the next official update, whether that's tomorrow or whether that's in a few years. Now, for those of you that made it this far and are still watching, I do want your opinion. Do you think that Aspyr should have been given the chance to continue working on the game and continue building their vision? Or do you think it was a good thing that Aspyr lost the project and that it was given to Saber Interactive? Let me know in the comment section below. As always, if you enjoyed the video and found it informative in any way, please do hit the like button, it helps me out a great deal. And if you haven't, perhaps consider subscribing to join the biggest growing Knights of the Old Republic community on YouTube. I'll see you guys in the next video. But until then, may the Force be with you. Always.